The battle for the mind of North America will be fought in the video arena.
Well, thanks, Jason, and thanks everybody for coming this evening. Normally I don't stand in front of a podium but Max wants me to because he's filming. And even though I don't wander around, I think he wants those posters in front. Is that right, Max? Yeah, okay, so here we go. So for those of you who don't know my background, I should tell you just a couple of things about me. But before I do that, how many people have never been to an APP event before? So there's a number of you, that's good. And how many here are already on the independence train and want Alberta to become a sovereign country? All right, is anybody who doesn't want Alberta to become a sovereign country? No? Okay, well I tell you, that's gonna make it a whole lot easier, I can tell you. But so just in a nutshell, my background and how I got into this was I was a cardiovascular and thoracic surgeon and critical care specialist, and I started Western Canada's first heart and lung transplant program, directed it, and the intensive care unit for about 32 years. And I retired in 2016, but I'd always been very concerned about Alberta's relationship with Canada. And during my years in practice, I served on the finance committee of successive provincial conservative governments. And I had a lot of input, believe it or not, behind the scenes, drafted a number of reports for the government, and everything from tax reform to health care and other things. So, and I had been very, very frustrated because of the national energy policy. My family was directly compromised, and many of you who remember the national energy policy know the devastation that Albertans experienced subsequent to that. But in 2003, I had an idea. It was actually 2002, but it came to fruition in 2003. I wondered if there was a solution to fix the dysfunctional relationship between Alberta and Ottawa. And I came to the conclusion that there was, after studying the Constitution and Alberta's history. So I was talking to Ralph Klein in 2003 at the annual general meeting, that was in January 2003 in Red Deer, and I said to Ralph, Ralph, I think I've got a solution to fix the dysfunctional relationship between Alberta and Ottawa. And he says, you do? And I said, yeah. Would you like to hear about it? And he said, absolutely. And so I said, well, it was based on this question. If you were the president or the prime minister of the sovereign country of Alberta and Canada came to you and said, we would like Alberta to join Confederation under the current terms and cost of membership, would you? And he looked at me and smiled and he said, to ask the question is to know the answer. Of course not. So from that, I said to him, well, I'm glad you said that, because the corollary is, don't you think you have an ethical, a moral, and an economic responsibility to Albertans to fix this dysfunctional relationship? And he said, yeah, I guess I do. So I had already started drafting a document, and I said to him, well, I'm drafting a document which will describe the algorithm on how to make that happen. And so over the course of the next few months, I completed the draft of that document. And I ran it through prominent politicians, MLAs such as Ted Morton and Gary Marr and Steve Smith, and federal politicians like Don Mazinkowski, who was also a good friend, and constitutional lawyers like Jerry Shapur from Calgary, and other professionals and non-professionals. And then I completed it. It was entitled Alberta at the Crossroads. Status quo. In other words, we don't do anything, we just accept what's going on. Refederation, we try and fix our circumstances within Canada. Or autonomy. At that time, autonomy in my head meant Alberta becoming a sovereign country, independent of Canada. And so I met with Ralph in his office in August of 2003. And we spent about an hour and a half together. Like I said, he was a really good friend, so we had a good time. And he's quite the jokester, as some of you may know. Anyhow, he asked me at the end of that meeting if I'd like to present it to caucus. And I said, sure. And he also asked me, he said, how will you prevent caucus members interrupting your presentation? I said, don't worry about that. I've given hundreds of presentations. I'll deal with any caucus members that want to interrupt me. And so, in any case, I left, and my secretary and I started working on a PowerPoint presentation. And then I got a call from the chief of staff a few weeks later saying that I wasn't going to be able to present to caucus. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, well, no, your document is about separation. And I said, no, it isn't. It's not about separation. It's about leverage. It's about solving the imbalance in power between the federal government and the provincial government. And it's based on the Clarity Act, okay, which is the legal pathway for a province to leave Canada. And I said, this is the only way that you will ever solve the imbalance in power between the federal government and the provincial government. Now, to be fair, in 2003, Alberta was doing well at that time. And there was less incentive to move forward with, for example, a referendum on sovereignty, because that's the leverage that's required. But you might be interested to know that the chief of staff in the Premier's office at that time was a former federal member of Parliament. His name was Peter Elzinga. So it's understandable why he wouldn't be supportive of a discussion with caucus on the mechanism to solve the imbalance in power, okay? But because Alberta was doing really well at the time, there was far less incentive. But you know, that's one of the things is you can't predict the future very well. Fortunately now, we can predict the future because Mr. Carney has told us what the future is going to be. And for those of you who know something, has anybody here read his book on values? So Jason and a couple of people in the back, they've read it. There's a really good analysis by Peter Foster. He did a first analysis in 2021, and then he did a subsequent analysis January this year of his book. Now, I've read his book, and some of the things in Peter Foster's article, I couldn't find the exact terminology, but some of it is interpretive, okay, in terms of his book on values. It's a tough read because there's a lot of economic information and terminology that most people don't think about, so you need your thesaurus beside you to understand certain things. But that's okay. But in essence, you know, Mr. Carney, he is a prominent member of the World Economic Forum, and he is very much in favor of a green agenda. He's bought into the CO2 narrative, and because of this, and his wife is very much an ardent environmentalist, but because of this, he does tell us that in order to deal with this climate emergency, there must be rigid controls on individual freedoms and on business, and that's business that's aligned with the oil and gas industry and agriculture as well, and on financial institutions that finance these businesses. But it's interesting, and I just digress, because just very recently, the alliance that Mr. Carney created of other major banks in the world to not finance oil and gas and agriculture has fallen apart. All the other major banks that were involved with that alliance have pulled away from it. So that's a good piece of information. But nevertheless, he goes on to say, I do not promise that things will be better for ordinary people. Ordinary people, doesn't that sort of bug you a little bit? I'm an ordinary person. You guys probably think you're an ordinary person, but what does he mean when he says that life will not be better for ordinary people? What does he think of himself? He thinks of himself as someone elite, above everybody else. In any case, he does say, I do not promise that life will be better for ordinary people. In fact, temporarily worse. Be careful about temporarily. Temporarily worse. Fewer choices, less travel, less meat, more inconvenience, and more poverty. That doesn't sound like a future that I think we are interested in. Now, on top of that, he goes on to say that he wants in order to achieve these objectives, okay, he's going to introduce, just like the World Economic Forum has recommended, China has already done this, to implement environmental, social governance metrics, okay, to control you. So in other words, as long as you're compliant with what the government says regarding environmental issues, governance issues, and social issues, then you will have access to meat, you will have access to travel, you will have access to your account. But if you're not compliant, they will have the ability to control you. Because how will they do that? With a digital ID, which he's a big champion of, and a programmable central bank digital currency. Now that hasn't passed through the legislature yet, but this is his thinking. And in order to ensure in perpetuity that the Liberal government remains in power, he wants to lower the voting age to 16. Now, the only problem with that is that, you know, many people who are 16 are very bright, but they haven't really experienced a worldview about a lot of other matters. And the companion legislation that he wants to introduce at age 17 is a universal basic income, which if you're 17 and you're getting $2,000 a month, what's the incentive to pursue a higher education or a skill or a trade? So you see the problem here is that, and many of you have seen this already, how many small businesses have gone under? And the World Economic Forum, in their playbook, they do describe all of this, a hollowing out of the middle class and the creation of an underclass that will then serve the needs of the elite class. And like I say, I think this is an anti-humanist agenda. And I personally certainly don't subscribe to it. So the alternative then is what can we do otherwise? Well, there's a lot that we can do. And because this crowd already knows that they've already made their mind up about Alberta sovereignty being the answer, I want to address that particular issue of what does it mean for you? Okay, Alberta becomes a sovereign country. What happens to you next day? Alberta is now a sovereign country. You get up in the morning, you go to the bathroom, you have coffee, maybe you have breakfast. What's different? Look at your bank account. It'll have increased enormously. Okay? Why? Because you're out from under all federal regulation and taxation. Now, what does that mean if you're still employed? Well, if you're employed, and just for the math, if you're making $100,000 a year and your average tax is 43%, consider being taxed at the rate of maybe 8 to 10% maximum. And if you're a corporation, you're taxed at 23%, now you're taxed at 12 to 15%. And because all other federal taxes are gone, the goods and services that you purchase cost less. So the benefit is enormous that way. But what about other benefits that are tangible but we don't think about? Well, we're out from under and this is the essence of sovereignty. You know, sovereignty in simplistic form is self-governance. It's freedom from external interference. So sovereignty also means, in its highest form, is God. For example, sovereignty in its highest expression is the ultimate power and control. It's ultimate power and control. This is why we say God is sovereign. Nothing's above God. But pragmatically, it's not a left or right issue. Pragmatically, it's also freedom from persecution. This is important to understand because what you may have experienced is political persecution, economic persecution through taxation, for example, excessive taxation and regulation. What about cultural persecution? What about religious persecution? We've seen that. And you all will remember medical persecution, and on top of that, regulatory persecution. So you're not just economically better, you're better from a cultural, religious, regulatory, medical, everything better. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about a sovereign individual. And you as sovereign individuals, you know, when you give up your sovereignty by being overregulated, or you give up your sovereignty by being overtaxed, you become controlled and you have far less ability to purchase the goods and services that you want. So we want to be, as a sovereign individual, sovereign families, sovereign future, we want to be less regulated, less governed, and less taxed. And that is a fundamental economic objective that when I say pragmatic, it's not a left or a right issue. You can see that even people that don't support sovereignty right now cannot help but be benefited, right? All right, so before I get into some other issues, what I want to do is open it up to the audience, and let's do some Q&A, and then I'll take you through our first meeting with the U.S. administration, our meeting with Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, the leader of the Parti Québécois, and then our second meeting with the U.S. administration. So, all right, any questions so far?
So, speaking of government, somebody will have to govern the new Alberta, the Republic of Alberta. How do we prevent that not another crazy like Carney sneaks in and becomes the leader of Alberta?
That's a good question. Okay, so I'll answer it this way. Once you have a successful referendum, okay, at that point in time, what happens is the current provincial government is now empowered, and the federal government and the other provinces are obligated to negotiate with Alberta in good faith, okay? That's pursuing a legal pathway to leave, and based on the Clarity Act. And so following or during those negotiations with the other provinces and the federal government, Alberta would be holding a constitutional conference in order to define the form of government that it wants to implement for the people of Alberta. And we've been working on that constitution already. It's virtually complete, but we have some, Bruce Party, who's a constitutional lawyer from Queens, is working with us as well, and he created a constitution for Alberta also. So we're integrating some of his ideas into our proposed constitution. Now, the way we prevent this from being hijacked, if you will, is that the Constitution, if I were to describe it, it's a constitutional republic. We would be wanting Alberta to become a constitutional republic. That what you would see in that is it's based on the U.S. Constitution, but it has far more checks and balances. So, in other words, each of the, like the executive, the House of Commons, or the House of Representatives in this case, the Senate and the judiciary would have separate branches that oversee each of those areas. And the obligation is that everybody who's an executive or member of the judiciary or the Senate or the House of Representatives has to follow strictly the Constitution. So the highest form of authority is the supremacy of God, the Constitution, the people, and that are then served by the government. And because there's far more checks and balances, and the people who are elected have only 2 terms, all right? That's important to understand as well. And then every department, and there would be far less government, every department is audited every 3 months. So there's far less opportunity for fraud, waste, and abuse to occur in any of those departments. So that's the form of government that would take place. But during the Constitutional Conference, representatives from all walks of life would contribute, finalize it, send it out to the public for a vote, and there may be more than one form of constitution that's sent out for a vote, and the public would make that decision. But we expect that the people that would be voting for the form of constitution that we're recommending are people that are longing for freedom and prosperity and self-determination. So I don't know if that fully answers your question, but right now it's at least a start. But yeah.
So that's awesome. I like that. But what if, like, the terms are still 4-year terms, but they can only be elected twice?
That would be the idea. But the one other thing I should have mentioned to better answer your question is recall. The ability to recall corrupted individuals, whether it's in the bureaucracy or in government.
How much of our national debt are we going to inherit when this goes through?
Well, that's a really good question. So the question is how much of the national debt would we be obligated for? The national debt right now is in the order of $1.3 trillion. Okay? So it's $1.3 trillion. But you have to understand that Alberta has given to Ottawa through equalization, the national energy policy, confiscatory federal taxation, and regulatory costs over $800 billion already. If you think of that $800 billion, had it been invested, it would have created trillions of dollars of increased economic activity. So we don't think we would, but again, this would be part of a negotiation. So there's other things. You know, we might say, well, okay, we've got Crown lands to deal with. Okay, so just for everybody's edification, 60% of Alberta are Crown lands. But of that 60%, 19% is controlled by the federal government and 81% is controlled by the provincial government already. So we've been negotiating on the 19%. So we might say, well, we'll take a certain amount of the debt, but we want all of the Crown lands and the national parks. So you see, that would be part of a negotiation. There are other things that have to be negotiated. For example, would there be any change to the borders? What happens with treaties? What happens with NAVCAN? What happens with the military? What happens with access to tidewater for our goods and services, especially oil and gas? So there's a number of things that would be negotiated, but we've anticipated that. And what I think is quite important for everybody to look at is on our website is the Value of Freedom document, in which what we've done in that document, which was contributed to by business people, accountants, economists, actuaries, other professionals and non-professionals who have viewed it. So that document's on our website, and it looks at where we are now and where we would be as a sovereign country without any federal influence. In other words, no federal regulation, no federal taxation. And over the course of a couple of years, 3, maybe 5 at the most, we'd be out from under all provincial taxation as well, with the promise that at some point after that we could get out from under property taxes. And the reason we can do that is because our fiscal capacity surplus, when we're not giving $70 billion to $75 billion to Ottawa, and we only get back 30 to 35 at the most, that $40 billion surplus is what can be used to eliminate provincial income tax and other costs as well. So it's a pretty unique opportunity. So I'd encourage everybody to have a look at that document. Like I say, it's been well vetted, and of course the left is going to find some issues. I shouldn't say the left, I should say the people that oppose Alberta sovereignty, because there are many people, actually union members, etc., that recognize when they understand the benefit to them, are supportive. They may support the NDP, but they support the idea of a sovereign Alberta as well. So I encourage you to have a look at that, and there's a lot of information in that document, and when we've got the interim constitution completed, we'll be sharing that as well, and I think that'll be an interesting read for everybody as well. But again, these are long documents to review, but because all of the areas are highlighted or labeled, you can go to the area of your interest in particular. So, yeah, go ahead.
Good evening again, Dennis. Adam Harris from Warburg. My question goes back to the good faith negotiations under the Clarity Act. What happens when those fail? Because you know that the Liberals, their first chess move is going to be delay. And what do we do when they fail? Besides a shot heard around the world.
Right. So the question is a good question. What happens if negotiations don't go well? So let me take you through some aspects of the Clarity Act to tell you what can happen, okay? We don't know what will happen, but I can tell you what could happen. So the Clarity Act is this legal pathway for Alberta to leave. And it was based on a question following the 1995 Quebec secession referendum. And the federal government posed a question: does a province have the unilateral right to leave Canada? And they posed that question to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court did a detailed analysis, and their conclusion was that a province doesn't have the unilateral right to leave Canada, but I'll leave section 154 and 155 for a minute. I'll tell you that a little later. But that one of the points that I'm trying to get to is that although we don't have you wouldn't have the legal right to unilaterally declare your independence, there's a political way to make an unlawful declaration of independence. That's not the pathway we're going down, but that is a potential option. I can explain that later. Let's get back to the Clarity Act. So 3 criteria. 1, there has to be a clear question. 2, a clear outcome. That's 50% plus 1 in a democracy. And 3, demonstration that you have consulted other interested parties, such as Métis and other political parties, as an example. The 4th paragraph of the preamble, this gets to the answer to your question. The 4th paragraph of the preamble states that a successful referendum and the criteria that those 3 criteria have been met obligates the federal government and the other provincial governments to negotiate in good faith, and acknowledges that negotiations might lead to secession. Now that's a very interesting statement. Negotiations, good faith negotiations between Alberta, the federal government, and other provinces might lead to secession. This gets to the heart of your question. What happens if negotiations don't lead to a happy outcome for Alberta? In other words, the other provinces and the federal government don't agree. Well, the Clarity Act is unclear at this point. It doesn't describe what happens at that point. So you could make 2 assumptions. Okay, negotiations, well, actually 3. Negotiations are successful. Alberta is removed from the Constitution and Alberta is a sovereign country. Or 2, negotiations fail. And that would mean that ostensibly Alberta can't leave Canada. All right? Ostensibly. Now, is it possible to have an unlawful declaration of independence? Okay, now we get back to the Supreme Court's analysis of the the Supreme Court's analysis of the question that was posed to them: does a province have the unilateral right to declare its independence? Okay, Section 154 says this: if a people in an area find themselves in a colonial relationship and there's evidence that they've been subjugated, these are the exact words, subjugated, dominated, exploited, or self-determination inhibited, they have the right to hold a referendum on sovereignty. Section 155 now, though, amplifies this by saying that although a province doesn't have the lawful right to unilaterally declare its independence, it could declare its independence in an unlawful fashion and become de facto a sovereign country when other countries acknowledge the successful referendum. That is a key issue, okay? So that brings up then part of the reason why we went to the U.S. in April, okay? We wanted to know where the U.S. stood on the idea of Alberta sovereignty. Think back when Mr. Trump and the Republicans were elected. What did he say? He said, I want North American-wide security, and I want energy security. Well, what could Alberta offer? It could offer the first domino to be followed by Saskatchewan, the Northwest Territories, and the Yukon, possibly central and northern BC. But those are dominoes. Each one of those areas would have to have their own separate referendum. So when we went to that first meeting, before we even sat down in the conference room, it was stated to us, the U.S. administration is solidly in support of Alberta's sovereignty. Okay? That was a very important point. We also talked about the U.S. acknowledging Alberta as a sovereign country following a successful referendum. Now, if that happens, okay, think of this. Successful referendum occurs, okay, and once the votes are all counted, the U.S. calls, at that point, still Premier Smith, and says, we acknowledge your successful referendum and your sovereignty. The Premier at that point could then go to the public and say, citizens of Alberta, we've had a referendum on sovereignty. It was successful. And today I declare Alberta is a sovereign country, without going down the rabbit hole of endless negotiations. At that point, what she's done, backed by the U.S. acknowledging it, she solved the imbalance in power. Now when she negotiates with the federal government, this is the unlawful approach, unfortunately, not what we're advocating for. We're hoping that there will be, saner minds will prevail, and a successful referendum means that the other provinces and the federal government will negotiate in good faith. But if they don't, this is the only alternative. And she can then say, today I unilaterally declare that Alberta is a sovereign country. And at that point, now she's negotiating, and she has truly solved the imbalance in power between the federal government and the provincial government. And she can demand certain things at that point, rather than just simply negotiating, like the federal government always demands things of Alberta and other provinces, correct? All right, so let me see if there are any questions at this point.
I think you may have already answered it, but I'm wondering, I hear a lot on social media about the Saskatchewan wanting to come on board and northern BC and all that. Is there any talks with our people in Alberta with the other provinces, like even for guidance or what they're thinking or is there any progress in those provinces?
It's a great segue into my next comments. Yes, we've had town halls in Saskatchewan. Mitch, our CEO, is going to be, I think, next Saturday, or this coming Saturday, I think, is speaking in Saskatchewan.
Good. I just want to add to that. Lost my train of thought. Sorry. I was excited there for a second. Darn, it was important too.
Other provinces?
It has to do with the other provinces, yeah.
Well, they have to have their own referendum. Yeah.
Well, if we end up in negotiations with the federal government, the fact that Saskatchewan and most of BC would like to leave also, maybe the Northwest Territories and whatever, wouldn't that give more leverage to successful negotiation with the province is concerned?
I think you're right. I think it probably would. But before I carry on, let's see what the other question is. A couple of questions.
I just want to point out to the right side of the room's asking all the questions. The right side.
Well, they're on the right to me.
Hi. I was a lot of people I speak with are concerned about social programs such as healthcare and things like that. So if you could maybe elaborate on how the transition would affect those programs.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, social services, healthcare, education, they can only be enhanced. I can tell you from having spent 32 years in the healthcare system that we have serious problems at every single level. I'll just give you an example of how bad the system really is. And for many of you who have tried to access the system or find a family doctor, you may have noticed some serious issues. But here's something that a lot of people don't know. In 1995, Alberta's population was 3.8 million people. There were 5,000 employees for Alberta Health. It was called Alberta Health, not Alberta Health Services. Now it's Alberta Health Services, which I think is an oxymoron. Anyhow, the population has gone from 3.8 million in 1995 to 5 million, okay? It's increased by 1.2 million. How many people do you think are employed at Alberta Health non-services now? 130,000. 130,000. So ask yourself the question, could there be some fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare system? Yes, there could be. There is. There are at least 9 levels of management. In some areas, there's 13. So the difficulty that any provincial government has is managing this, because the public tends to trust the medical profession, the nursing profession, and it's so difficult to deal with these sorts of issues. But there's, and in the healthcare, our budget is 75 billion, our Alberta budget. 26 billion goes to healthcare. There is a tremendous opportunity to improve cost, quality, and access, but it takes courage to do that. You have to get out from under the Canada Health Act in order to really effectively fix the system. If there is fraud, waste, and abuse in the healthcare system, what do you think might be occurring in other areas as well? All right? It's the same thing. The opportunity to provide fidelity and quality of service to healthcare, education, and social services is at hand if we have the courage to actually do it. We can solve the problem of homelessness. We know how to do it, okay? We can solve the problem of our education system right now. And if you believe in choice, then that is fundamental to individual freedom. If you are a collectivist, you don't believe in choice, right? So we can solve the problem. We can improve things for everybody. On top of that, on the healthcare side, billions of dollars goes south of the border because people just can't get their care in a timely fashion, and those who have the means will leave. I don't mean necessarily leave the province indefinitely, but leave for healthcare. Some will go to the U.S., some will go to Mexico, some will go to Spain, some will go to India. It's remarkable to think that is happening. So the answer to your question is we've thought through all of this, and there's no question all of the social services would be dramatically improved. None of us want to see First Nations people in poverty, homeless people on the streets, people waiting for hours and hours in an emergency room, or months or longer for health care, or having poor quality education, or no education at all. So we have to solve these problems, but we can't do it in our current system. That's why we need to shake the tree. And this is the only thing that can do it. Another question.
Back here.
Do you think Ottawa's woken up to what's going on out here now?
Oh yeah, no, Ottawa's woken up, but that's an added segue to a comment you made earlier. What about other provinces? So let's look at Quebec. Paul Saint-Pierre Plamondon, the leader of the Parti Québécois in Quebec, which is the separatist party, is leading in the polls massively. They've won the last 3 by-elections. They contacted us. They contacted the Alberta Prosperity Society, the Alberta Prosperity Project. They wanted to meet with us. And a few Thursdays ago, We met for 4.5 hours at the Palliser in Calgary. It was a fascinating meeting. Fascinating. So when you ask the question, are other provinces wanting to leave? Quebec is right there, so is Saskatchewan. But here's the interesting things about the meeting with Mr. Plamondon. After the pleasantries of the introduction, he said that when we asked, why do you want Quebec to leave? And he said, 3 reasons. We want to preserve our language, our culture, and we want to get out from under federal corruption. Now, that's what he said. Now, when he talked about federal corruption, he's talking about federal political corruption and bribing people to do certain things. And then we talked about equalization. He said, and he spontaneously said this, he said, we don't need equalization payments. He said, we've created a value of freedom document as well. We know, just like you guys, that if we're out from under all federal regulation and taxation, our fiscal capacity surplus that we would have available will be far greater than the $14 billion that you guys give us. Okay? And he said, what you probably don't know, and we didn't really understand this point, he said, those equalization payments are used to corrupt the system. They are used to bribe Quebecers and other politicians to stay in Canada, okay? To buy Quebec's loyalty to Canada. That's what he said. I was surprised to hear that. But he went on. We talked about energy and pipelines. And he something that I wasn't aware of is, why do they not support a pipeline going across Quebec? It's because they do have a belief, and there is evidence for this, that pipelines sometimes leak, okay? And they don't want a leak occurring in their province. That's number one. But number two, he said, if we need more energy, all we need to do is dam another river, okay? I mean, their power comes from hydro, all right? What's that?
Has that been excused from equalization?
Oh, yeah, it's excluded from the balance sheet. That's right, because it's quote-unquote clean. But then the third thing that I didn't know is their refineries in Montreal can't handle our heavy crude. So they couldn't even refine it. So it does make sense. Other things that were interesting, we talked about their society. And he said, I'm a social democrat, okay? And we believe in collectivism. In other words, it's, I guess you could call it the majority rules. I would say the problem with democracy is the tyranny of the majority over the minority, okay? And in Alberta, we believe in individualism. We have a heart. Yes, we work hard, but we'll help our neighbors out because we have a heart to do that. We don't need to be a socialist society in that context where your individual freedoms and rights can be abridged because of the tyranny of the majority over the minority. So that was an interesting point that we talked about. And then the other interesting thing was, which I loved, this is really heartwarming, is he said, you know, if Alberta was a separate country and Quebec was a separate country, we would get along very well because we would collaborate on those areas in which we're aligned in our thinking. But in other areas, we just respect one another. And you do what you want, we do what I want. And it's the whole concept, and this comes from Quebec, I'm sure you've heard the term, vive la différence, right? Celebrate each other's successes and the difference. Every province is different. Every province has something to offer different from another province. And so why not work on celebrating and working together where we can, but acknowledge our differences and support other provinces to do what they want to do to benefit the people in those areas. What the federal government does is they try and pigeonhole everybody into one line of thinking, and this is the only way to do things according to the federal government. And this is an anathema to individual thinking, to people who have the ability to think for themselves and to think, well, this is what I want for myself and my family and for my retirement, as opposed to the federal government trying to make everybody do the same thing. This was very important to understand. And then finally he said, when Alberta is becomes a sovereign country or has a successful referendum, I will acknowledge Alberta as a sovereign country. And we said we would do the same to Quebec. Now, one other thing about that meeting, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, and that is our form of government right now is called one of two things. It means the same thing. Either it's called a parliamentary democracy or a constitutional monarchy, okay? So consider that in Canada, our form of government is a constitutional monarchy. And it's set up in which we don't have representation by population in the House of Commons or in the Senate, and we have no control over the Supreme Court. So, constitutional monarchy. Did you know that when King Charles was here, the Quebec, during the opening of Parliament, the entire Quebec legislature, which represents all of the provincial political parties, in a 100% vote, voted to end their relationship with the monarchy. Think about that. So they voted to end the relationship with the monarchy, and they never even signed the Constitution Act 1982. So you could ask the question, well, what are the implications of that? And Mr. Plamondon wasn't sure. Okay, now he is a lawyer. He's been the leader of the Parti Québécois for 5 years. But thinking through this, he said, when I become premier, I will also end the tenure of the lieutenant governor in Quebec. All right, so they never signed the 1982 Constitution. They've divorced themselves from the monarchy. They've got rid of the lieutenant governor. Are they already a sovereign country? I don't know. But it has serious and real implications because we are still laboring here in Alberta under a constitutional monarchy. But if they're not involved in our Constitution, then do we even owe them equalization payments, just as an example? But the implications of this are profound. They are profound. So I asked him, I said, have you read section 154 and 155? Because maybe you can just unilaterally declare your independence. But he said, no, we're going to have a referendum. So I said to him, I said, well, you lost twice, why take the risk? You know? And so any case, the polls right now are pretty solid for sovereignty in Quebec, but they don't have a winning number yet. When the 1995 referendum in Quebec took place, prior to the referendum, in polling, 1/3 of the population voted, or had in that poll, was in favor of Quebec leaving Canada. But when the referendum took place, it was like 49.5 versus 50.5. You know, I mean, it was that close. It was within a fraction of a percentage point. So here we are in Alberta. We already know or believe that we have a plurality. Maximal polling that we've seen has been in the high 40s. So, but there's other reasons why we think we're leading, and if we had a referendum today, that we would probably have a majority. And I'll just explain this to you. Why I think we are where we are at. If you look at or consider cancel culture, okay? Think of the U.S. election. The polling didn't predict that the Republicans and Mr. Trump were going to win in a landslide. It didn't even predict that they were going to win. And the exit polls, same thing. All right? And then look what happened. The reason that happened, that the polls were so dead wrong, was because people didn't want to say how they really felt in a poll. In Canada, we had a more recent, or not a more recent, but we had a terrible experience with the trucker convoy, right? People had their accounts frozen. All right, so how many people, knowing what the federal government can do, and a poll is being conducted, and the question is do you favor Alberta sovereignty or do you favor Alberta remaining in Canada? Click, no answer. People don't want to say how they feel, right? They don't want to have the risk of being canceled. Now, that may be coming less and less now as the movement gets more and more traction and people are more comfortable to talk about sovereignty. But here's one other thing to think about. In 2021, we had a true referendum, and that was to end equalization. And many of you people probably voted. 62% of Albertans that voted, or the vote by the people who voted, 62% voted in favor of ending equalization. That's the point that I'm trying to make. How many of those same people would vote for sovereignty if they knew that the only way to end equalization was for Alberta to become a sovereign country? I don't know the answer to that question. We've never actually conducted a poll on that. But from a logical perspective, just thinking logically, that could well have been the case in 2021. All right? If it had been a different question, if the question in 2021 was, do you support sovereignty if this is the only way to end equalization? Could have still been 62%. May not have been, but now, given what's been going on, it's much more probable that that would be the case, right? So this is why, part of the reason why we think we have a plurality already. And we've conducted some internal polling as well. So now, any other questions?
From the online audience here. One of the questions from the audience who are watching online is, when will the EPP, when is EPP going to release the proposed constitution?
Okay, that's a good question. Jeff Raff, our general counsel, and his legal team are reviewing the document, but we're also dealing with this court issue regarding our referendum question. So they're tied up with that to an extent. At the very moment, the integration of Mr. Bruce Party's constitution into the constitution that we've already drafted is taking place. So from a timing point of view, I'd like to say that we think we can probably have it out before the UCP AGM, which is towards the mid-end of November. That would be a realistic timeline. You know, we've said on a couple of occasions we should have it out next week. Well, we've said that a couple of times now, and that's kind of like, you know, what is it when you, yeah, well, and yeah, so anyhow, I was thinking is when you cry wolf, right? That's what the term I was thinking of. And so you can't cry wolf too many times, and when the wolf doesn't show up, you know, so that would be my best guess. I know myself, I've had a deep dive into the initial constitution that was written, and as the chair of the Alberta Prosperity Society, which has a board of directors, which governs the Alberta Prosperity Project, I want to be sure I see that document before it goes out as well. So anyhow, but I do trust my colleagues. I just want to be sure because I always pick up something. Anyhow.
We got a couple more questions for you. Here we go.
Thank you. I understand, and I think it's great that Quebec is kind of on board. That kind of answered another question that I had. However, I'm curious, when you say negotiating in good faith, Canada negotiating with Alberta in good faith, I know Canada doesn't want us to leave. We're the cash cow. So what would that entail? Would it be like Alberta Next kind of things. They throw us some stuff and say, oh, okay, we let you do this, we let you do this. Like, what is good faith to keep us interested in staying?
Well, that's a question we've actually posed to the Premier, okay? And the question is what could Canada possibly offer to Alberta that would be superior to getting out from under all federal regulation, control, and taxation? They couldn't offer anything. But the heart of your question as well is the issue of negotiating in good faith. Do we think that the federal government and the other provinces will negotiate in good faith with us? I don't think so. So it then triggers what I said, sections 154 and 155 in the Supreme Court's analysis of the Quebec secession reference. So there's more than one way to skin a cat here. But, you know, we in the Alberta Prosperity Society and the Alberta Prosperity Project, we want to follow the letter of the law. What the Premier does when she's given a mandate to negotiate in good faith, what she does with that is going to be up to her and her government. But I would think that given the reality that we would not be at this point, or the probability of winning the referendum wouldn't have occurred had it not been for what we collectively have done with help from other freedom organizations and independence parties, that we should be also at the table. No, we don't have political license for that. Let me put it this way. We don't have electoral license to do that because we haven't been elected. But I think we have political license because of what we've accomplished with all of you. Because we're working on behalf of all of the people in Alberta. And I dare say we do want to help other regions as well achieve the level of sovereignty that they want too. So, but it's a good question.
This one is kind of about property rights. So a lot of property owners here, and in Canada we pretty well rent our land. So they're showing that they could just do what they want anyways, regardless of your title. So would that change? Would anything?
Yeah, the issue of property rights is really an important issue. And we've had internal discussions as to should we eliminate provincial, like when you have a successful referendum and Alberta is a sovereign country, question is, should we eliminate provincial income tax first or should we eliminate property tax? We're having that discussion. And I favor property tax as well because provincial income tax could be very, very low. It could be, if we pay a value-added tax, but not on medication and food, of maybe 4 or 5%, kind of like a GST, but we've only got maybe a 5% provincial tax. Getting rid of property tax would be really important. David Lametti, the former Minister of Justice in the Trudeau government, has said that Canadians, and you're correct, do not have the right to own property. And, if you own your property if you think you own your property, you have no mortgage on it, just don't pay your taxes and you'll find out who owns your property. You're right, we're renting it. They could take away your basketball if they wanted to. And, what's really on the docket right now, and there's a lot of discussion, how many people here are firearms owners? Yeah, me too. So this is an issue of property. This is an issue of protection. And what they're doing is illogical because it's not legal firearms owners that are creating a problem in society. So the final answer to your question is by eliminating property taxes, when you buy something, you will own it. And we've been pushing the idea as well. That could include mineral rights as well. Wouldn't that be amazing? So.
Yeah, the Canada Post, the big banks, and what for currency would we be using if we're successful?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we trade oil and gas in U.S. currency now, right? It makes sense for us to move to a U.S. currency. Even the Premier has talked about that. All right? Now, but let's look at reality here now. Prior to what looks like a successful referendum on Alberta sovereignty, what do you think will happen to the value of the Canadian dollar? Right. Right. All right. Okay. So you would think then that you've lost your purchasing power, right? That's what you think. Okay. But is that true? Remember, you've also gotten rid of all federal regulation and taxation. And now you're in a situation where you have a Canadian dollar that's not worth as much as it was before, right? But all the goods and services that you're going to acquire don't have those regulatory costs and taxes on them either. So there's a balance there, all right? But the logic is that we would move to a U.S. currency. And we've put on the table to the U.S. administration, because it's out there publicly, we can state that. We don't have affirmation or confirmation that they would do this, but the notion is put there before them to think about. Would you consider converting a Canadian dollar to a U.S. dollar at par for Alberta citizens? So I don't know that that will happen or not. But the bottom line is that don't be worried about the purchasing power, because I think it gets compensated by reduced costs of goods and services. And if we move to the U.S. currency, which is what we would very likely do, then again the cost of goods and services goes down as well. But now you've got U.S. purchasing power. So I don't think there's going to be a problem. The problem is going to be for other regions of the country. That's where they're going to have a problem. Now, what else? I was going to say something else about that. Oh yeah, the other thing is that we've looked at, and in the Value of Freedom document, as you get towards the end, you'll see that we're also contemplating the idea of creating, at some point in the future, a U.S. currency. I mean, an Alberta currency. And why do that? Because Alberta, as a sovereign country, might be the only country in the world that has no debt, except maybe Norway. Norway doesn't have much of a debt at all because they've got nearly a $2 trillion sovereign oil fund. Yeah, so Alberta would have virtually no debt, and it could create its own currency, which could become the strongest currency in the world because it would be backed by our natural resources, which are in the mega trillions of dollars. It's not just oil and gas, it's forestry, clean water, agriculture, minerals that we don't even know about yet, once there's more prospecting that is done, et cetera. Gold, silver, et cetera. So that is, another consideration. But we don't want to get too far over our skis on some of these things because we have to see how things unfold. But remember that in a sovereign country, the economic boom that will occur here occurs because of, let me give you a background comment, first of all. You know that we've lost in the last several years over $500 billion of planned investment in Alberta because of federal regulation and taxation. And you know that of all industrialized countries in the world, economic growth is dead last here as well. So think about Alberta becoming one of the least regulated and taxed regions in the world. What does that do for business who might be looking for a place to locate? They will move here. It'll be unbelievable because that's what business wants. They want less regulation and less taxation. It benefits everybody. It benefits even union members. And this is why a lot of union members are joining. They may vote for the NDP, but they're going to vote for Alberta sovereignty because they want the economic benefit, so.
Two questions. One is about those people like myself who are building RSPs in Canadian dollars. This is more like a question, like an economic question. What's going to be the outcome for the people who are essentially on my situation, who are building RSPs in Canadian dollars in an institution which is based in Ontario in this case?
Right. So the question is, yeah, and that's a good question. We've had that question before. So what happens to your investments when you've got RSPs or RIFs in Canadian dollars? Well, they're still in Canadian dollars to start with. If you'll have the ability to move them into U.S. currency, for one thing. You can move them into Alberta-based institutions if you want. But remember, it's no different. If you're living in Spain and you're getting your RSPs, being paid to you in Spain, you have to convert it to outside of a Canadian currency to a Spanish currency, as an example. So you won't be compromised in that way because, again, going back to the comparison, your Canadian dollar drops in value, your RSP drops in value, but the cost of goods and services drops as well. So people need to think this through. They need to talk to their accountants and that sort of thing to make decisions that are in their best interest. But I think that's a really good question. There are so many issues that have to be addressed, and what I want you to think about is don't be fearful of them. If you're going to be fearful of something, be fearful of what's coming if we do nothing, okay?
And another question that is raised a lot in the chats as well as town hall meetings: immigration. How are we going to enforce immigration? Under which parameters? That sort of thing.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So
I lost my train of thoughts here. Sorry.
Okay. So immigration. It's a really good point to talk about here. I don't know if I have the exact quote correct, but Mr. Trudeau made the point that old white people are a relic and we will replace them. Okay? That's what he said. And has he followed suit? If you look at the growth of immigration, we now have 2.5 million people coming into the country on an annual basis. We have a population of about 44 million people, okay? There's a number of people, maybe 20, 25 million, that over a period of time are going to pass on, right? Because they're older, they're like me, okay? Ancient. And then relic, yeah, exactly. And over a period of 4 years, 2.5 million per year, that's 10 million people. So you see exactly what he said he was going to do, he's going to do. He says, and we will replace them, and he is doing that. Okay, so how do we deal with this? As a sovereign country, you can control immigration. We would control immigration. People who are deemed not citizens, they don't have a right to be here, or they are part of a criminal element. If you look at the policy in our Value of Freedom document, I wasn't necessarily in favor of the terminology that was used, but Jeff Rath is a lawyer, he's a constitutional lawyer, and he wanted this. And he said the immigration policy that we're proposing is based on a point system, and it's based on the Canadian point system, but it's the immigration and deportation policy. So, for example, there are many landed people who are here on work visas, about 5 million, but the federal government doesn't know where all of these people are. And visas are, people are becoming unemployed. Their work visa, they should be required to leave the country, but we don't know where they are. So then many of these people are then requesting refugee status, in which case, for a family, That's $87,000 a year. All right? So I think that's the correct number. It's either 82 or 87. I'm just, I had a minor Joe Biden moment there. So it's one of those two numbers. And so the point is that even reasonable that our taxpayer should be on the hook for this? No, it shouldn't. And this is why Jeff brings up the idea of an immigration based on points and deportation based on criminology, or you just don't have the right to be here because your visa's expired. So, and that's important. For the referendum, by the way, you will have to prove that you are a Canadian citizen and that you've been a resident in Alberta for a certain period of time, and you have to prove it with documentation. Okay? Well, we don't know. For the Quebec referendum, it was 6 months. Okay? Listen, this is not in my control. This is not in my control. This will be the purview of the provincial government to make that decision. Well, it wouldn't be the provincial government at that. Well, yeah, it would be because it's going into the referendum. But this I want you to understand as well. What we found at some of the much larger town halls, people will come up to us. They're from BC. They're from Ontario. They're from Manitoba. They're from the Maritimes. They've moved here because they believe Alberta will become a sovereign country. They will vote for sovereignty. Some of the refugees will. Many of the many individuals, for example, the Oriental folks living in Alberta, the Indians, Sikhs, etc., who are business people, they will vote for sovereignty as well because they've lived here. They're the ones that are already here. And when you have a new immigrant come into an immigrant community that's been established, that new immigrant coming in gets influenced by the immigrants that are already there. And the immigrants that are already there are educating the new people about the benefits of sovereignty as well. So you've got to think about this carefully before you jump to the conclusion that they have to live here for 10 years before they can vote, because that won't fly with the provincial government. We know that. We're hoping that at least it can be 6 months. A year would be better, but like I said, it's not in our control. We're an educational society, not a political organization. So.
We got.
Yes, well, that's the people who have visas.
We got one last question here.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Todd Keller. Dennis, I don't know if you could answer this question or not, but who become the new leader of independent Alberta, and what would happen with the $300 billion that we overpaid into CPP?
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So just to answer the question on the billion, it's actually up to $400 billion now that we have over contributed to. Because it was $235 billion 2 years ago, but when you add in the amount of overage that we're paying, actually you're right. I'm sorry. It is $300 billion. The overage that we pay plus interest on that takes it up to $300 billion. So what happens to that? That right now we have information back from the federal government that they would give us back $160 billion of that. They should be giving us the whole thing. But again, it would be part of the negotiations, just like it would be part of the discussion regarding, what portion of the national debt would we take, if any. You see, what happens to Crown lands, what happens to military, et cetera. Military bases is what I mean. So, and sorry, what was the other question? Oh, who becomes the leader of an independent Alberta? So, well, let's look at this from the perspective of Brexit. David Cameron was the Prime Minister in England, and he campaigned against Brexit. He did the honorable thing when the Brexit referendum was successful. He resigned. Okay? So, ostensibly, a successful referendum in Alberta, and those negotiations start with Premier Smith, okay, and the UCP government. And should she be successful in those negotiations, and the new constitution is formed, she becomes the prime minister of the sovereign Commonwealth country of Alberta. Let me explain that, because I know you're saying, what? Commonwealth country? What do you mean by that? You just talked about getting out from under the monarchy. All right. So there are 56 Commonwealth countries in the world. 36 of them are constitutional republics that have zero relationship with the monarchy. Okay? So, Premier Smith becoming Prime Minister Daniel Smith, heading up the Constitutional Republic of the Commonwealth of Alberta, it's very likely that she would take that position. I've asked her the question, would you be willing to be the Prime Minister or the President of the sovereign country of Alberta? And she said, well, I don't like the idea of president, but I'm not going to David Cameron myself. Okay. So you could interpret that, because David Cameron, was it David Cameron that I said? I think it was, yeah, David Cameron was the leader during Brexit. Again, I want to be sure I didn't have a Brexit moment there. So, I mean a Biden moment. See, I had one right there. That's a third one tonight. So she would be the leader, and but it would be a whole new government, okay? Because when you go from being the premier of the province of Alberta, and you have a legislature the way it's structured right now, to becoming a constitutional republic, there has to be new votes, okay? And people will compete for those positions. But if Premier Smith does what we think she will do ultimately, and become the and compete for that position, very likely she will win. See, there's two key things for Daniel Smith to do for the public, and you see that she is not coming out and saying I favor Alberta sovereignty as a separate country. She's said that multiple times now. However, she is the one, and her government is the government that reduced the threshold from 600,000 to 177,000. She's come out publicly, as well as Mickey Amory, the Minister of Justice, and said, we want the Alberta Prosperity Project question to go forward, right? She's done that. But what she has to do to get to a point where she can lead this, okay, and come out one way or another, is she has to do two key things. She has to prove to the public that she and her government can govern. Check. She's done that. Second, she has to prove to the public that we can't deal with the federal government. We can't get a deal. We can't get those 9 demands that she's put on the table in front of Mr. Carney when she said, if these demands are not met, that's a threat to national unity. That can only mean one thing: Alberta leaves. Her Alberta Next panel has put 8 constitutional demands out there. Well, the hurdles to change the Constitution make that impossible as well. So at some point we expect, but I don't have evidence for this. I don't know if she will do this or not, but we would expect that, given her rhetoric and those 9 demands and those 8 constitutional changes, that if she doesn't get these things, that she should be able to come to the public and say, citizens of Alberta, we cannot deal with this federal government. Would you give me the power through a referendum so that I can negotiate from a position of strength? Okay? That's what I'm hoping that she will do. Whether she does it, I don't know.
Thank you very much. Dr. Modry?
Sorry?
Oh, yeah, get him UCP membership, he said.
Oh, about a UCP membership? Yeah. Okay, yeah, this is, thank you for bringing that question up. So this is the issue, is that we as an educational society, we're nonpartisan and nonprofit. That's important. But the issue of education to the public the public has to understand that if you want serious change, you have to deal with power. And the provincial government, the UCP government, right now has the power, okay? But what can we do? There's a board of directors there are 18 members of the UCP Board of Directors. All of them, but I think one, are supportive of Alberta sovereignty, okay? It's really important. Every year, half of that board is subject to re-election, and somebody else can compete for that position. So we want to ensure that people who are aligned with Alberta sovereignty are the ones that are elected at the AGM in November. This is why we want people like yourselves to go to the AGM and vote. And we will be advising you of people that we believe support Alberta sovereignty. And then you can make your own decision as to, which individuals you wish to vote for. But right now, this is an important step because the UCP Board of Directors controls a lot of activity. And some of the Federalist MLAs are not happy with the UCP Board of Directors. So, but they're the ones that need to be replaced as well. Those MLAs need to be replaced. So, and that can happen at the constituency board level. And so, whereas we're not working on that, but there are people that on the board that are aligned, different boards throughout the 87 CAs, there are people on those boards that are aligned with Alberta sovereignty. Not necessarily the Alberta Prosperity Project, but they may or may not be, but they're not happy with their MLAs. So we'll see what happens there as well. It would be very helpful for us if not only we had 100% of the UCP Board of Directors that are sovereignty oriented and MLAs that are not are replaced by their CAs prior to the next election. And then finally, you should know that of the UCP members right now, we understand that roughly 2/3 of them are already in favor of sovereignty. But so that's something to think about as well. Important, people will say, I'm not interested in politics, but politics is interested in you. And if you don't get involved with your politics, then you're just accepting whatever is coming down at you. So are we at fault for the way things are occurring to us? Yes, we are. We are 100% at fault. We can fix ourselves. We can fix this Alberta. And by extension, I can tell you people around the world are hoping that we are successful as a beacon of hope and a pathway for them to get sovereignty as well. So we have tremendous support from around the world as well. We have to make this work, okay? We need to stop the globalist agenda, and we can do it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Modry. And after 3 Biden moments, I'm going to help you down the stairs.
Well,
make sure you're okay.
I can walk down the stairs, but I got to say thank you very much for your attention and your really good questions from the bottom of my cardiac surgical heart.
And another quick reminder, during the municipal election, make sure you vote for people that also support your beliefs. That's an important one. And I'll be holding a town hall this Wednesday, October 15th. Come and have some more conversations.
One other thing, folks. We're having a rally at the legislature, so you know that. We're hoping to have 100,000 people there. That will make a statement. It'll be the largest rally in Alberta history, maybe in Canadian history, on something. So please come.
Thank you very much for your time. So let's give it to Dr. Modry. He came all the way out here to come and hang out with us. Thank you very much for your time.
He bought me dinner.
I did buy him dinner. He doesn't eat very much, by the way. And beef dip at Salt and Pepper in Breton. Try it out.
It was delicious. Thank
you very much.